So first, what does merit, what does the idea of a level playing field mean in higher education and student affairs? It often means that we're thinking about who gets access to what, who is deserving, right, of access to higher education. So when we think about anti-Black racism, what does that mean? And how can we think about merit, access, general issues in higher education? What does that mean when we're going to apply anti-Black racism to that context? Right? So what does it mean? My question on the board here is, what does it mean to study anti-Black racism in higher education and student affairs, not necessarily at that individual level that we talked about last Thursday, but at a structural level, at a systemic level? So what would be some of the things that you would anticipate that we'd be talking about if we're talking about anti-Black racism in higher ed or student affairs? Every level you go up gets less and less diverse, right? Like, so undergrad, actually, like, not from campus to campus, but overall, if we look at the number of students who are enrolled in undergraduate education, so that includes community colleges and four-year colleges, it's actually not too far off the representation of the United States. Not too far off. Now, if we get to college by college, that's a whole different situation, right? But just enrolled in undergraduate education. But then if we look at grad school, less representation, particularly from Black and brown folks. Get to faculty, really low levels of representation. And I used to edit a journal called the Journal of Diversity in Higher Education, right? And there are decades of research that say this, to the point that if someone was submitting a new paper to me saying, like, I want to talk about the underrepresentation of people of color and the racism they face, I'd be like, we know that. Like, tell me something that we don't know, right? So it's really well established that what you said is the case. And that really ties into, you remember last Thursday, y'all generated that list of stereotypes, right, about Black folks in education spaces. It applies to higher ed too, right? Like, not just K through 12. So all the beliefs and biases that there are about Black people continue to play themselves out in higher ed, right? Like, just because someone's a college faculty member as opposed to a high school teacher, an elementary school teacher, or an administrator on a college and university campus, or you've graduated from high school and now you're in college, like, you still carry all of that same stuff. And there's actually some really interesting research on college students and what they think they know about diversity versus what they actually know about diversity, and not so much, right? Not so much. A lot of folks don't even look at least in my space, when we talk about retention rates, we don't look at 4 years or even 5, we look at 6-year retention rates, because it takes longer to complete college than I think most of the time we think it is going to take. So I wanted to start by sharing a little bit. I taught a class a few years ago in my program, right, in the student affairs program, on social justice in student affairs in higher ed, right? And so when I sat down to do the syllabus, I was working with a TA. I was like, so where do we begin, right? Like, do we start just talking about college? And I was like, no, we can't even start there. So we spent several weeks, like, way before college. So we talked about the historical legacies of slavery. We talked about K through 12 schooling segregation, right? Schools now are as, if not more, segregated than they were in the 1960s, right? So students often don't go to school with the folks who look different from them, which is problematic for a lot of reasons, but unequal investment in pre-K through 12 schooling is one of the reasons why it matters a lot. Right? So there were lots of conversations about the desegregation of schools, particularly in the 1960s, and that they were desegregated on this notion that those schools were inferior, right? That they weren't as good, that they weren't preparing students as well. But now folks like, of blessed memory, Derek Bell and others really challenged that notion that it wasn't that the schools were of inferior quality, it was that they weren't resourced very well. And that we actually lost a lot of brain power, we lost a lot of investment in Black students when we lost those schools, because Black teachers also lost their jobs, right? So that unequal investment, though, in K through 12 schools is still happening now. Like, if we look at the amount of resources that are given to a particular school based on the demographics of the students in the school, we see that schools that have a high concentration of Black students, of Latino students, have less resource, right? They have less funding going to those schools. The teachers tend to be not as experienced. The leadership tends to be not as experienced. And that doesn't mean that they can't be successful, but it also is another barrier towards those students being successful and college ready. We see disparities in college access, so we talked about that quite a bit in our class. And then finally, we got to experiences of students on college campuses, right? So we had to do all of this contextual work, right, to understand what does anti-Black racism look like, or what does social justice look like on a college or university campus. And then we also talked about post-college outcomes, because the degree to which, I'm an educator because I believe in the power of education, right? Like, I believe in it in a social level. I truly do. And I'm only standing here because my grandparents and my parents believed in that, right? And folks who look like me, right, are less likely to benefit from education in the same ways as other folks do. Does that make sense? All right. So we're going to, that's a long pathway. We're going to try to narrow down just a little bit, right? And right now, this is a conversation that we're having a lot in higher ed. I know that y'all have already had conversations about affirmative action, Supreme Court decision this summer, right? Like, I know y'all have already kind of dialogued about that a little bit, but I want to narrow in a little more in talking about how this is playing out in education generally and in higher education, right? So when I think about what affirmative action did, or what race-based admissions was aiming to do, in my head, it's this accounting for structural racism, right? So that an admissions officer may not know that individual student and what they have access to, how they've experienced the world, but there's this knowledge, right? There's these decades of research that suggests that Black students are more likely to be at lower resource schools. They're more likely to be exposed to various forms of racism in and outside of the classroom. So how can I account for that? And how do I bring more diversity onto my campus, right? So one of many factors to be considered. So that's not going to happen anymore, right? And we can debate that and have conversations about that. But I've been lucky enough to be in rooms with school leaders who are trying to figure out, like, well, what happens now? How do we maintain our commitments to equity and diversity and to outreach without this very important tool that we have? So we're going to shift the conversation in that way a little bit. And one of the ways that we do that is by thinking about, okay, so if I can't account for somebody's race, right, if I can't check the box, what are some ways that we can start to do a better job of recognizing how anti-Black racism plays out in pre-K through 12 education and is going to show up in admissions so that we can mitigate against that? Does that make sense? Like, how can we build better structures that better recognize talent if we can't just make some assumptions about what a student does or does not have access to? Does that make sense to folks? Okay. So you've already started to talk about this a little bit, but when you think about inequality, anti-Black racism in K through 12 education, and you think about an admissions process, right? So someone like me sitting at a table reading an admissions file, what could have happened in someone's K through 12 schooling that would have an impact on what I'm reading in my hands, that admissions file that I'm holding? So these are some of the things that folks are talking about a lot right now, right? Like, so if you looked at the higher education literature, which around college access is interesting because it often includes like high school, so 8 through 12, into the first couple years of college. So not scrolling back as far as some of y'all mentioned, although we probably should scroll back that far. But if we looked at the literature to see, like, okay, so what are the major anti-Black, dimensions that might ultimately have an influence on whether or not someone's going to get into college, the research would kind of fit into these big buckets, right? So we have reliance on standardized tests, right? SAT, the ACT. I showed y'all some data last Thursday, right? Like, we know that there are some differences between students, racial and ethnic groups, and how they tend to score on the SAT and the ACT. And I think there are a lot of people asking questions about, like, so why is that, right? And if we just say, like, oh, well, the test is fine, it's the student, that to me kind of, you're subconsciously saying, like, so are there differences between what Asian students can do and what Black students do and what Latino students can do? Like, if we had a test that actually was an authentic assessment of potential, right, and readiness for college, then you shouldn't have those disparities by group. Does that make sense? So there's some folks really questioning, A, the validity of the SAT and the ACT across racial and ethnic group, but B, whether or not we should use it at all in terms of making admissions decisions. And I don't know if y'all have heard this much, but the SAT and the ACT, your score doesn't predict much. right? Like, so if we think like, oh, well, this is predicting how well students are going to do once they're in college, so we need to use it to know how well they're going to perform, that is actually incorrect. Yes?
Aren't they not even like accepting SAT scores anymore?
Different schools have different policies on that.
Yeah.
So
Like it doesn't matter as much as it used to.
it doesn't matter as much as it used to. It's complicated, right? So some schools are business as usual, right? Like we require that you take one or the other of these tests. Some we are test optional. So you don't have to take it to apply. But if you do, you can send your scores if you want to. Then there's a third category that says, we do not accept your test score. Take it if you want to, don't send it here, right? So each of those categories has pros and cons associated with them, right? So some folks would argue that if you say like, if you get rid of standardized tests altogether, that you then miss the student who maybe did go to an underperforming high school but is high potential and knock the test out the box, right? And that's ultimately what folks would use as an indicator of their potential, even though it does not predict for much, but that's a whole nother conversation. Yeah, it tests a very specific way of showing up and being able to perform, right? Like, it's not worthless. It just tests a very specific thing. And I'm not convinced that that very specific thing is going to lead someone to be successful in college or in life, right? Right? So, I mean, I think we wrestle with, and when I have conversations with folks in my college about, you know, more on the GRE end of things, like, are we going to use the GRE in admissions or are we not? You know, I can show you all the data in the world that shows you it doesn't predict for much, but I want to know why you're using it and what do you think it tells you? And does it actually tell you that? And if it actually tells you what you need to know, then I'm not going to tell you not to use it, but I think people uncritically view what an SAT or an ACT score will tell you. The second thing that people are talking a lot about is GPA. And research does show that GPA is actually a better predictor of performance than SAT. And it's not perfect either, right? Like that there can be bias in grading. There's a lot of conversation about grade inflation. And as you mentioned, access to AP coursework is not the same across schools or in schools, right? So that if we think back to whether or not Black and brown students are identified as gifted and talented, which would put you on the path to getting AP, being enrolled in an AP class, there's no guarantee that a student who, again, high potential, able to do the work, is actually going to get access to an AP course. I think looking just as GPA with a weighted grade for AP classes assumes that a student earned their way into that class based on merit. Does that make sense? And that's not always the case. And again, we talked last week, right, about how an instructor who has implicit bias might ultimately not be offering the same instruction to a Black student that they would be offering to another, right? I find the last two really interesting, and they were the subject of several studies that came out this summer right as the Supreme Court was weighing in on their decision, right? That wealth plays a really, really big role in college admissions, right? Not the same as race, right? Not the same as anti-Black racism, but as y'all have been learning, there's a really big connection between anti-Black racism and the ability to accumulate wealth, right? So folks talked about this thing called the private school polish, so that wealthy kids, might be more likely to attend a private school. And while they may have similar grades, similar test scores as a low-income student at another school, they ran some analyses to show that the lower-income student with equal grades, equal test scores was less likely to get into the institutions that folks were fighting about, these elite, very selective institutions, than wealthy kids. And they said part of the reason was this private school polish notion, right? That if you're going to a private school, you're going to a smaller school. You might actually have a specific college counselor, so not just your guidance counselor who's managing 350 people, but a counselor that's specifically there to help you with your college application, which can make your essay read nicer, that can kind of smooth things out, that is having conversations with your teachers about what they should be saying about you in their letters of recommendation. And their letter is stronger because they've gotten to know you on a more close and intimate basis, right? Versus you go to a big public school, serves thousands of students. That guidance counselor may not have a relationship with one of those elite institutions. They're like, listen, I'm just filling out the forms, I'm getting it done, I'm making sure the student gets their teacher recommendation, but it's not the same as the polished application, right? So as somebody who is an admissions officer, and I'm reading through 40 files in a day, those files are easy to read, right? Like they jump off the page. It's like, oh yeah, this student is amazing. Like you don't have a lot to figure out, but that student isn't necessarily any better, right, than a student who maybe isn't quite as polished. Does that make sense to folks? So there's lots of conversations in admissions right now, like you can't force students not to go to private school, right? And you can't tell counselors that they can't write, the letters that they write. But how do we do a better job of recognizing that it's not necessarily that the student is better, it's that they're presented in a prettier box, right? And then the final point was athletics, right? And I think athletics is tricky because we often think of athletics as being the source of diversity at some schools. So I went to UCLA shortly after they ended affirmative action of all, like any identity-based anything in higher education across the state of California. And they kept giving account of the number of black students at UCLA who were not athletes, right? Like they made a point of saying like, who were not athletes. So that often we think of athletics, right? We think back to those stereotypes as, oh, this is the road for more diversity on a campus, right? That schools have like looser admissions policies around those students. But the research that came out this summer suggested that like the majority of students on a college campus aren't that kind of athlete, right? They're not necessarily basketball, football, sailing, fencing, archery, gymnastics, like golf. Like there are a whole bunch of other sports that get a lot of attention in the admissions process, and folks may or may not be scholarship athletes, it may not be revenue generating, but they're getting additional quote unquote credit, like that's relating positively to their chances of being accepted. And black and brown families may not have the resources to be successful in those sports, right? So if you even think about like what it would take to be a top level soccer player, right? Like it's not just playing on your high school team. It's having coaches. It's playing on traveling teams. It's playing on club teams, right? Like that requires a level of wealth in a family, not just like monetarily, but like the time and the energy to be able to get your kid around to all those different things. Does this make sense to folks? Right? So that there are so many structural dimensions embedded in this process, it makes it really difficult to think about like, okay, well, how do we account for that, right? Like we're not recognizing race anymore, right? Like, so we're not allowed to think about a student's race anymore, but we have to think about how all these other factors are playing into admissions decisions. So if we want to do something about diversity on colleges and university campuses, particularly in terms of the admissions process, we have to really look at these things and rethink how we even do the work, right? So we've talked about like getting admitted, right? But then students get to choose both where they apply and then where they want to go. So how do y'all think about how anti-black racism plays out in the colleges that black students ultimately decide to attend? Right, so you get to make a choice where I'm going to go to school or where I'm going to apply to school. How does anti-black racism play out in the colleges that black students attend? That, I did not know this, I remember when I was trying to decide like where to go to college, but going to a public institution in another state is roughly the same in tuition as going to private school, right? So that limits your options a bit. Going to a state, so I'm from California. There's community colleges, there's California state universities, and there's University of California. University of California is the most prestigious, it's the research university. California state institutions, less elite or prestigious, more open access, and the tuition is cheaper. So if you're sitting down at the end of the day trying to make a decision about like what school you might want to go to, you might choose a CSU or a community college because of the finance part of it. We have traditionally black sororities and fraternities for a reason, and it was because they couldn't get into the other ones, right? That's how they started. For black students, right, like that question about what is my community going to look like may look kind of different, right? As you're trying to make a choice between different institutions, am I going to see myself on campus? Are there going to be organizations that are going to be welcoming to me and that I'm going to want to engage in, right? That's a different kind of set of questions sometimes than white students might be asking themselves. Once folks actually get on campus, you're still kind of managing this structural dimension that you have no control over, right? So, thinking back to the comment that I made at the start of class, high schools are pretty segregated, right? So this might be your first experience and encounter if you're a black student and you went to a predominantly black high school. Now you're at Yale or any big research university, and all of a sudden you're like, I don't see anybody who looks like me. It's been a really long time since I've seen someone who looked like me. And that can be a really significant shift, for sure. I would say that there's a book called The Privileged Poor by Anthony Jack that really touches on some of what Cynthia had to say. So she talks about, he talks about, it's more through the lens of wealth, but it touches on racism a bit too. There is a difference between being a Black student who maybe participated in a program that placed you in a highly resourced high school or a boarding school, and then going to a Yale, Harvard, or Princeton, and being a Black student who's low income, who came from, just like hustled their way through high school and got admitted. Their experiences in college were fundamentally different, because one group had been in the prep school environment already, and they're like, oh, I know how to navigate this. Like this feels like high school. Whereas the other students, like, it was all brand new, and they had a much harder time transitioning. It's a really, really interesting book. So should you have additional time to read it? Yes?
I don't know, maybe this will spark some imagination or whatever, but I was thinking about, counseling. The schools that your counselor directs you towards.
Yes.
Conversations about money and how you're going to pay for your education with your counselor. And then, of course, your counselor leading you to a situation where the school you're attending is like an undermatching situation.
Yeah.
And undermatching having that negative effect on student retention. So
right.
Being at a place where you feel like you're overqualified, you should have been somewhere else,
Mm-hmm.
can actually lead to dropout.
Yeah, absolutely. So had y'all heard of undermatching before now? Have you heard of overmatching? So a lot of the discourse, particularly when we're talking about race-based admissions, race-conscious admissions, never race-based, race-conscious admissions and affirmative action, is that these students, will, if they are not performing in the same way as their peers, right, like if they don't have the same SAT score, then they will be overmatched. School will be too hard, and they'll leave, right? There's a lot of research that actually has debunked that, and that's not true. And then there is undermatching. So attending a school that, like, academically you could hang with something a little bit more challenging, right? And that also leads to attrition, right? Like that if you're not able to really connect academically and intellectually with your institution, then that might also lead you to leave. And that counselors, right, who have their own biases and their own stereotypes that they're carrying around with them, and if we know that, like, Black students less likely to have college-educated parents, it might be at schools that are more likely to rely on those college counselors, that could lead you to choose an institution that isn't in best alignment with your needs. So who does undergraduate admissions? Does anybody know? The admissions office. Yeah, the admissions office, right? There is an undergraduate admissions office where there is a team of people who's trained to review applications, right? Who does graduate admissions? No. Yeah, so faculty do graduate admissions. People who have no training, oftentimes. So for years, like, I made admissions decisions, like, with, not alone, but like with my colleagues, and you read a file and you make a decision, right? And those decisions, like, especially if you haven't had training or, like, haven't been thoughtful about it, can be very biased based on, like, I don't know anything about Morgan State, but I do know University of Maryland. Like, yeah, that's a good school, right? Or, like, I know the faculty at that school, I don't know the faculty at this school. So where you go certainly can shape where you go afterwards, right? And you can have a really wonderful, please do not hear this as me saying Morgan State is not a good school. You can have a wonderfully rich experience on those campuses. And even in campuses where you've undermatched, you can have a wonderfully rich experience on those campuses, but it takes more effort for you to, like, kind of find your way and find your path. Those institutions, I'm going to talk about this in just a moment, should we get there given time, also have, so the student really has to kind of do that themselves, as opposed to more well-resourced institutions which have everything kind of nice packages and programs, and it's a little easier to navigate. So I just want to touch on some of these things. Again, literature base around some of these questions, right? So things that y'all mentioned. There is this concern that we're going to lose, that Black students are going to lose access to elite higher education, right? Given all the things that I mentioned about admissions processes, right? And the ways that anti-Black racism is embedded in the metrics that we use to assess whether or not someone gets in. there's that concern. There's this notion that less selective institutions that students may attend will, it's not like you're not getting a college education, but those institutions are under-resourced. They have fewer supports for students, including sometimes financial aid, that those schools might be more tuition dependent. So maybe not even as much financial flexibility. A lot of those most elite institutions now have financial aid policies based on wealth, where actually you go for little to no cost, right? And then finally, you know, and y'all spoke to this in lots of different ways, but racial climate can be a central factor in choosing and whether you're able to stay. Okay. Did you have something?
Yeah. I had a question if undermatching and overmatching was also true for grad school or just like undergrad?
They've only studied it in undergrad, but that's a really interesting question for grad school. That's a really interesting question for grad school, but usually it's studied in undergrad. Yeah. All right, let's keep trucking along. So going along with this notion of like college choice and where students will choose to go. Post-SCOTUS, lots of conversations about Black students maybe choosing that they're going to go to HBCUs in increasing rates, right? Like they're like, forget all this, like I'm gonna go to an HBCU, right? These institutions that are founded with the mission of supporting Black students, right? Like that is written into their mission. And we saw an uptick in the number of students who were choosing to go to HBCUs as we came out of 2020, right? Particularly as we had that summer, we were having lots of conversations about racism, about equity, that we saw more Black students making these intentional choices like, hey, I'm gonna go to this institution that was actually founded with a mission to support me, right? So my first exposure to HBCUs was through watching A Different World. I might be dating myself. Has anybody heard of this show?
I used to watch that.
Okay, you used to watch that show? It's an oldie now. But as a kid, this was one of the 2 shows I was able to stay up past 8 o'clock to watch. Like, I was able to watch The Cosby Show. That was the first show I was able to watch past 8 o'clock. And then on Thursday nights, it was a special night in my house. I could stay up till 9 because I got to watch A Different World at 8:30, right? And for the first couple seasons, they actually don't make it explicit that it's an HBCU. There's just a lot of Black folks in college. And I think I didn't even understand it to be one until like later on I'm like, oh. Robert, did you watch too?
I mean, religiously, I have the same policy. Literally, Thursday was the night I could stay up past 9, and, 2 9.
Yes, absolutely, absolutely. So my early understandings of what an HBCU was were shaped by this show, right? And since then, you know, I've had the opportunity to encounter them in a lot of different ways, you know, higher ed researcher, so like I get to think about different institutions and different institutional types and what that means. And one of the things that we know about HBCUs is they serve a disproportionately large percentage of the Black community given the number of HBCUs there are, right? So there aren't like a ton of HBCUs, there's a good number of them. But the percentage of Black graduates, like the percentage of Black people that have degrees from HBCUs is larger than one would expect given the number of HBCUs there are. I think it's something like they're 2 or 3% of all institutions, something like that. But they graduate maybe 15 to 20% of all Black graduates, right? There's a lot of research that suggests that Black students who graduate from HBCUs are more likely to go to grad school, prepare a disproportionate number of folks who go on to get PhDs or to become scientists or lawyers, right? So they're really important institutions. And there are lots of stereotypes and things that people think about HBCUs. You know, so I'm not gonna play the video, we'll post the slides, you can watch the video, but it's from CBS and kind of explains a lot of the issues that Robert just took up, right? That HBCUs are complicated places because they do have this reputation for being better sense of community, more focused on student achievement and success. It's an intrusive environment, right? So people are in your business. Like they're gonna make sure, like they are trying to make sure you succeed and that you're gonna stay in classes, right? And that you're gonna do well. And often lower retention rates, and maybe not necessarily for academic reasons, but all the other reasons that are happening, and lower resource, right? Like they don't have the same financial resources, and they are more tuition dependent on average than a historically white institution is, right? So why they don't have as many resources, right? It connects to structural racism. So HBCUs there's a set of criteria that they have to fulfill to receive federal funding, right? So federal support is supposed to come, and that support is supposed to be matched by states. And in many cases, states did not match it. So the story that's in this video is that the HBCUs in Maryland actually sued the state for their resources, and they won. So now there's this question of like, where are these resources going to come from, right? Like, how are folks going to move forward? And they kind of make the point in the video that is this going to encourage HBCU systems in other states then to really like sue their state, or are folks going to move a little bit more to ensure that these institutions have the resources that they need, right? Speaking about donors and wealth and endowment, right? Look, I see this differently now as a dean than I once did, right? Like an understanding what good is that, or why do we have to invest in that? For the most part, most of the new buildings you see going up around campus are connected to a significant gift, right? Like, so yes, the institution pays its part, and yes, the state pays its part, and a significant gift often is part of that. When I think about the scholarships that I give from my college, often connected to alumni gifts or friends of the college gifts, that how much money you're able to generate ultimately can influence very much the experiences that your students are able to have on a campus, and how you're able to support them. Having an endowment, I didn't know what that was or what that meant, right, for a long time, but it's essentially the money the institution has in reserve for whatever they might need, and they actually don't spend that amount, they spend the interest. Right? So the larger the endowment you have, that doesn't mean that you have like billions laid around that you can use to write checks for people, but the money the interest that is generated off of that is what is spent. So if an institution has a low endowment, they don't have that interest to be able to invest. Does that make sense? Yeah. So we are gonna keep staying with money, because that is one of the major structural racism issues that affect post-secondary education, and close our conversation today with paying for college, right? Because we see a lot of inequality when it comes to how students pay for college and their debt post-college. So y'all had a brief on this, right? Looking at how people thought about their debt, what they were doing post-college, whether they felt like it was worth it, right? But when we think about what allows students to pay for college, what are some of the factors that play into that? Yes?
Financial aid.
Financial aid, yes. I saw some hands flutter up over here. I'll go to Savannah and then back to Benjamin. Yeah.
Like 529s.
Okay, whether or not your family had a 529.
Yeah, my family had a 529 because my mom was actually going to UMD when she had me, so her parents are like, yeah, we're going to save money for this kid.
Mm-hmm.
So that is a privilege, you know, not everyone can do that. So
Yeah, absolutely. It requires financial knowledge and income, like expendable income that you can put into the 529. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, Benjamin.
Financial literacy.
Yes, yeah. I think generally, like, I was just signing my life away when I was going to college. I was like, where? Sure. Like, I don't think I even fully understood it until I was getting my PhD. Like, oh, okay, this is how all of this works, right? And we see that more in Black families, that Black families are more likely to, like they're more willing to borrow to fund their education than families from other racial and ethnic groups. This all matters, right? Like there's lots of factors that go into whether or not someone's going to be able to pay for college, right? So parent salary and wealth, right? Or parent salary and wealth, or generational wealth. Right? Like, so did your grandparents set up a 529 for you, right? Like, or, did your grandparents just say, like, we'll cover it all, right? Did they write that into their will? Like, there's a lot of things around, like, family wealth that may influence what schools you choose to apply to and where you ultimately are going to go. The institution you choose to attend, right? Both the cost and the availability of aid. And there's a lot of conversation in higher ed about need-based aid, right? Which purely, like, expected family contribution, like what does that student need? And should that student be expected to take out loans? And schools with bigger endowments say, nah, we got it, right? Schools with smaller endowments, not so much, right? Like you have a need and, well, let's get some loans together for you to cover that need. Versus merit-based aid, which is based on those metrics that we talked about earlier that are problematic for college admissions, right? So some schools may say, you do not need to submit your SAT or ACT for admission. But if you want a scholarship, then you have to submit it, right? Or with graduate school in particular, I wasn't terribly worried about what my GRE score was for admission to my graduate program, but I knew enough to know that if I wanted a fellowship that was gonna cover my time in graduate school, I needed to knock it out the box. Does that make sense? Okay. So your eligibility for merit aid. The degree program that you are applying for has a really significant impact on your ability to pay, right? So are we talking about, like, not even at the undergraduate level? So we're going into like my area of scholarship. Are you pursuing a PhD, a master's degree, or a professional degree? Don't know if folks know, PhD programs should pay for themselves, right? Like, you should have some kind of research or teaching assistantship or administrative assistantship on campus, 20 hours a week-ish, and they pay your tuition and give you a stipend. Not true for professional degrees, right? Like, those usually have big price tags associated with them. Often not true for master's degrees, sometimes. But some institutions use master's degrees actually as revenue generating. So I was like, yeah, we don't have a scholarship for you, right? So I'm not going to talk down about my peer institutions, but there are some very elite institutions who have colleges of education who will offer a one-year master's degree, and people want that credential, and they're like, and you'll pay every dime and dollar for it, right? Like, so you're paying $50,000 to have, elite name on your resume for a one-year program that I would argue does not prepare you as well. Does that make sense? Okay. And what career you want to pursue and what your salary, your anticipated salary is, can very, very much factor into someone's ability to pay, right? So there's a lot of conversation right now about debt relief and all kinds of other things. There are programs that that are supposed to forgive your loans if you take certain public service professions or income-based repayment. So there's a big, big, vast conversation about what this should and could look like, but it's really important to think about like how structural racism is even embedded in the choices that you make and your ability to pay. Yes?
My brother went to law school on the basis of getting the public service loan.
Right. Yeah.
I think it's 10 years, something like that.
Yeah.
He's up to $250,000 worth of.
Woo! I mean, and there are some people who go to med school like through the military, so you have to give the same number of service years back. Like, there are lots of programs out there like that.
My husband's going through that too. He works for the government now, and it's in yes, technically year 3 now of repayment, even though he hasn't had to repay with all the COVID stuff on loans and but and he's even for him, he said it was just such a hassle trying to do that, and the government, the loan issuers are going and moving loans around, and then it affects your repayment plan, and they don't put you on the correct payment plan that you need for the PSLF.
It's difficult, right? It's difficult. So I think this is one of those things that like people are up in arms. Are we calling it Twitter or X here? I call it Twitter. Twitter forever. Twitter forever. So we're calling it Twitter. People go in on student loans, right? Like there are people, like everybody, right? And structural and anti-Black racism fits in the sense that Black students borrow more and tend to have more significant debt burdens. Black women, in particular, significant debt burdens, right? So this is just a quick screenshot. I was pulling some data from the ACE website, equityinhighered.org. I think I mentioned it on last Thursday when I was talking about like where I get my data, best place to get data. And I was scrolling down the page, this popped up, right? And I was like, perfect for class, right? Like everything you kind of need to know about the state of the Black community in relation to this debt conversation is on the slide, right? So 86.4% of Black bachelor's degree recipients borrowed to go to school, right? I'm in that 86.4%, right? Like I borrowed. And that it's not so much that you borrow, it's the interest and the amount of time it takes you to pay back, right? So that you are paying back so much more than you ever borrowed in the first place, which is why people continue to stay in debt, right? So it's this difficult double bind that we're in, right? We know that post-secondary education is linked to positive outcomes and mitigating inequality, right? Like that's why so many folks in Black communities are so invested in the notion of education, particularly college, right? I remember the gift that my parents gave me in telling me like, you go wherever you want, we'll figure it out, right? Like that's a pretty significant thing to be able to say, right? Like, and I didn't understand it at the time, but now I'm just like, yo, like that, like that's, I am hopeful that we will be able to say the same thing to our son, right? We know that the more education you get, you're more likely to have more income, more wealth, you're more civically engaged, you're healthier, the more education that you get, right? And the more education you get, the more debt you incur in pursuit of higher education, right? And that perpetuates inequity. That it can be a deterrent for future terminal degrees, right? So you take out a lot of undergraduate debt, you can't even begin to wrap your mind around the law degree or even the PhD, where you still may need to take out loans even though you have a stipend and you have your tuition covered. That it's a delay in financial advancement and wealth accumulation. So particularly for folks, for example, who get PhDs in science, it's not just, you're not done at the PhD. You got a postdoc after that, right? And you're still not making a ton of money. That like, and your loans are continuing to accrue interest, even if you can get them stalled, right? Like that you're not only putting off your income, you're putting off paying back this significant debt. And it can determine what careers that you might pursue. So we're in the midst of something I think about a lot, you know, Dean of the College of Education, is that we're in the midst of a teacher shortage, right? And if I'm talking to really talented, smart students like yourselves and trying to encourage you like, hey, come over to the College of Education, become teachers. Y'all, come over to the College of Education, become teachers. But I often say like, students can't make passion choices, they're making pocketbook choices, right? Like, I'm taking out all this debt for undergrad and you want me to make what? Like, that's real. That's real. It can very much have an influence on what you decide to do post-college. And there are lots of fields where we need more diversity, we need more Black and brown faces, or we need more generally folks committed to equity and justice related issues, right? And that people would be like, yeah, that's great, but I got these loans to pay, or I want this standard of life. And the finances, like, I once heard a venture capitalist saying like, it's got to pencil at the end of the day, right? It's got to pencil at the end of the day. And if it's not penciling, then you can't make those choices. That makes sense to folks? Any questions about debt? No? Okay. So I'm going to leave you with just a closing thought from me and Robert. Hopefully you don't mind me leaving you with a closing thought. And it's 12:16, so I'm not going to make you answer this, but something I want y'all to think about. So you have completed your 2 weeks on anti-Black racism in the context of education. What are some things, like as you reflect back, that you heard consistently across these last 2 weeks? What are things that you heard Robert talking about, me talking about over and over again that has implications on how students experience education and how, perhaps more importantly in my mind, how they reap the benefits of education, right? And thinking about what we can commit to and how do we advance justice and combat anti-Black racism, particularly in education. Become teachers. But other than that, okay? Just really thinking about like, so, you know, this can be all really overwhelming. I think it's overwhelming for me on certain days. I imagine Robert would feel that way. I imagine Jeanette would feel that way. And I think I get around the overwhelm by trying to figure out like, what's the one thing that I can do? All right, thank you, everybody.